Placeholder. The word landed like a stone, dropped into still water, and Ondine felt the ripples move through her chest before she fully understood what she'd heard. She was standing just outside the open window of the great hall, her fingers still warm from the candle she'd carried through the corridor, the flame long snuffed by the night wind. The voice belonged to Saren, the Alpha's cousin, and it carried the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting a long time to say something out loud. That's all she ever was. Kale needed someone steady, while the council pressured him, and Ondine was steady, quiet, useful. Now that Mira has returned from the Eastern Territories, everyone can stop pretending. There was a murmur of agreement from somewhere deeper in the hall, a sound like water over stone, and then laughter, low and comfortable, the kind shared between people who believe they are alone. Ondine did not move. The candle holder was cool iron in her hand. The night air smelled of pine resin and distant rain, and the great gray wolf who served as Kale's sentinel sat 10 feet away on the garden path, watching her with amber eyes that held no cruelty. He was enormous and utterly calm, his silver-tipped fur unmoved by the breeze, and when he saw her face, he made a quiet sound in his throat, something between a huff and a question. She looked at him for a long moment. She did not cry. She had been with Kale for 11 months. Not as his mate, not formally, but as the woman who sat beside him at council dinners and pressed a cool cloth to his temples when the headaches came and argued with him past midnight about pack law and the welfare of the families in the outer settlements. She had believed that counted for something. She had believed the way he looked at her across a crowded room counted for something. She had believed, without anyone ever saying the words plainly, that they were moving toward each other. She set the candle holder down on the stone ledge very carefully, so it made no sound. Then she walked back through the garden, past the sentinel wolf who padded silently alongside her for 3 paces, before stopping at the boundary of the inner grounds, as if he understood she was leaving the territory of the life she had built here, and he could not follow where she was going next. She did not go back to her room in the East Wing. She went to the small set of rooms she had never fully stopped keeping, the ones in the village at the base of the mountain, the ones her grandmother had left her. She had kept paying the caretaker there out of habit, or perhaps out of a stubbornness she had not let herself examine too closely. She understood now that some part of her had always known she might need a door to walk back through. She packed only what she had brought with her. She was meticulous about this. She left behind the amber earrings Kale had pressed into her hand one evening in the market, telling her the color matched her eyes, which was not true. Her eyes were dark gray like winter sea, and she had known it was not true, and worn them anyway, because of how he had looked when he said it. She left them on the small table by the window. She left the embroidered shawl his sister had given her. She left everything that had arrived after she did. The blood oath ceremony was in 3 days. She would be gone before dawn. The village was a 2-hour walk in the dark, along a path she knew well enough to manage without a lantern, and by the time she reached her grandmother's door, her boots were wet from the dew-soaked grass of the lower meadow, and her hands were cold, and she felt, for the first time, the particular clarity that comes after a shock has finished echoing. She was not shattered. She was something simpler and more functional than shattered. She was decided. She built a fire, and she made tea, and she sat in her grandmother's old chair with the cracked wooden armrest, and she let herself think. Mira. She knew the name. Everyone in the pack knew the name. Mira had been Kale's first choice before the Eastern Crisis, before the territorial fracturing that had sent 3 packs into negotiation and exile and rearrangement, before the years of instability that had made a steady, practical woman like Ondine seem like exactly what an alpha needed. Mira was the daughter of the Eastern Alpha, beautiful in the way that pack stories always described the women who returned from absence, vivid and decisive, carrying the weight of everything she had survived. Ondine had no quarrel with Mira's beauty or her survival. She had a quarrel with the fact that Kale had known Mira was coming back and had said nothing to her, had let 11 months accumulate, had let her believe. She pressed her palm flat against the warm mug and breathed. She was 31 years old. She was a trained healer, one of the best the northern packs had produced in a generation, which was a fact she had spent most of her life understating, because Kale's pack valued strength in terms that rarely included the kind of knowledge she carried. She had a grandmother's house, 2 capable hands, a good mind, and no blood oath binding her to anyone. She was, she told herself firmly, free. The word tasted strange. She turned it over in her mind. Free. She slept eventually, in the chair, which was less comfortable than the bed in the east wing, but more honest, and in the morning she was up before the light came properly, and she was pulling winter herbs from the small garden plot behind the house, when she heard boots on the path. She did not look up. She knew those boots. She had learned the particular rhythm of his stride, the way you learn a piece of music you've heard too many times, even when you wish you hadn't. Undine. His voice was lower than usual. She cut a stem of sage with her small knife and laid it in the basket. Kale. She heard him stop at the gate. He did not come through it. That told her something. You left without. Without what? She looked up then, and she was glad she had slept, was glad her voice was steady. He was standing at the gate in his field clothes, not the formal things, and he looked like he had not slept, and she observed this without the tenderness she would have felt yesterday. Without saying goodbye, I didn't think that was expected. I thought I was a placeholder. I thought placeholders were just moved to make room when the real piece arrived. The silence stretched. A bird moved through the pine branches above the garden and was gone. Where did you hear that word? He said, and there was something careful in his voice, the way a person steps carefully over uncertain ground. Does it matter? It matters to me. She cut another stem and didn't answer. Her hands were entirely steady. She was mildly amazed by this. It wasn't, he started. He stopped. He tried again. What Saren said, whatever you heard, it wasn't. Was Mira coming back? Undine asked. She looked at him directly. Did you know she was coming back? His jaw shifted. That was enough. She's the one you wanted, Undine said, and she kept her voice even, not cold, just even, the way you state a fact that is difficult, but not complicated. Before everything fell apart, she was the one. I understand that. What I don't understand is why you didn't tell me. What I don't understand is 11 months, Kale. What I don't understand is amber earrings and a look across a crowded room, and asking my opinion on every decision that mattered to you. What I don't understand is why you let me build something in my mind without telling me it had an expiration. He reached for the gate latch, and she said, quietly, don't. He stopped. I'm not angry at you, she said. I want you to understand that. I'm not performing calm. I'm not going to cry and throw things. I am genuinely, functionally calm, and I'm asking you not to come through that gate, because if you do, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And I'd rather not have that conversation. I'm not going to sign the blood oath, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was coming through the pines now, long and pale, and it caught the silver at his temples that he'd had since she first met him, the early gray that made him look like the mountain itself, like someone who had been part of this landscape before she arrived and would be part of it long after. That's not my decision, she said carefully, and I'm not asking you to make any decision based on what I heard last night. I'm asking you to let me go. Those are not the same thing, and you know it. I know, she said. I'm asking anyway. He stood at the gate for a long time. Then he said, very quietly, I handled this wrong. Yes. I handled it wrong from the beginning. I let the council pressure become the reason I didn't. He stopped. He looked like a man trying to find the right door in a house he thought he knew. Kale? Her voice was gentle now, because she was not cruel, had never been cruel. It was one of the things she both valued in herself and sometimes resented. Go back. The ceremony is in 3 days. Your pack needs its alpha, and its alpha apparently needs things that I was never quite going to be. He made a sound she had never heard from him before, something sharp and involuntary, and he put his hand on the gate latch but still didn't open it. You don't actually believe that, he said. I believe that you had a choice to make, and you made it by not making it. And that's been the shape of this whole thing, hasn't it? You chose inaction. You chose to let time make the decision, and time made it. She picked up her basket. She went inside. She did not watch to see when he left. 3 days later she was still in the village, which she had not entirely planned. She had told herself she would move further, perhaps south, toward her cousin's settlement. But there was a family in the village, the Merricks, whose youngest child had a chest cold that had not resolved the way it should, and Ondine was not the kind of person who left a sick child to find another healer. So she stayed. She checked on the child each morning, a small, determined girl named Bee, with her mother's sharp brown eyes and her father's stubborn refusal to stay in bed. And she made her careful teas and salve for her chest, and she felt useful, which was something. She did not let herself think about whether the ceremony had happened. She was meticulous about this too. On the 4th day she was in the market square buying dried elderflower when Saren found her, or came to her, which was different. Saren was not cruel by nature. Ondine had always understood this. She was simply the kind of woman who said out loud what other people had the grace to leave unsaid, and this made her useful in certain situations, and terrible in others. She came across the square, with her hands in her coat pockets, and a look on her face that Ondine could not immediately read. "He didn't sign it," Saren said. Ondine looked at a bundle of dried rosemary and did not respond. 3 days ago, the ceremony. He stood up in front of the council, and the Eastern Alpha, and Mira herself, and he refused to complete the oath. He said, Saren paused. He said he could not in good conscience bind himself to one person when he had been dishonest with another. Ondine's hands were very still. The Eastern Alpha is furious. The council is divided. Mira, another pause. Mira actually seemed more relieved than anything, which is interesting. Apparently she had her own reservations and had been hoping for an exit that didn't require her to be the one to refuse. Ondine set down the rosemary. "Why are you telling me this?" Saren was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its usual certainty, and Ondine recognized the sound of a person trying to apologize in a language they had not practiced. "Because I said something I shouldn't have, and other people heard it, and you heard it, and you left because of something I said, and that sits on me poorly." "It sits on you poorly," Ondine repeated. I know it's not." Saren looked away toward the tree line and back. "I said it because I was jealous. My own cousin, and I was jealous of the way he looked at you, the way he talked about you when he didn't think anyone was paying attention, and I thought if I said it enough times to enough people, it would stop being true. That's a terrible reason. I'm aware." Ondine looked at her for a long time. "You were jealous of the way he looked at me. He looked at you like you were the answer to every question he hadn't figured out how to ask yet. It was insufferable." Saren said this last bit with a dry exasperation that was somehow more honest than any softness would have been, and despite herself, Ondine felt something shift in her chest, not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. "What you said was cruel," Ondine told her, "not because it was entirely wrong, but because you knew I would hear it, and you said it anyway. Yes, I need you to understand that. I do. All right." Ondine picked up the rosemary again. "Thank you for telling me." She walked home with her basket, and she sat in her grandmother's chair, and she thought about a man who stood up in front of a council and refused. She thought about what that cost. She thought about pack politics and the Eastern Alpha's fury and a divided council, and she understood that what Kale had done was not a small gesture. It was not a flower left at a door. It was a declaration made at cost, in public, in the language that Pax understood, which was the language of consequence. She did not go to him, not that day. She finished caring for Bia, who made a full recovery, and presented Ondine with a slightly crushed wildflower as payment, which Ondine accepted with great seriousness, and pressed between the pages of her herb journal. She put her grandmother's house in order. She walked the mountain paths she had always loved, the ones that skirted the high meadow where the pack's wolves ranged free in the early mornings, enormous and unhurried, moving through the mist with the casual sovereignty of creatures who had never doubted their right to be exactly where they were. She watched them from a distance and felt something she could not name, something between envy and admiration, the feeling of seeing a thing that knows its own nature completely. She thought about her own nature. She thought about what she wanted, not what was practical or politically wise or emotionally cautious, but what she actually, in the marrow of her, wanted. And she found, somewhat to her own irritation, that the answer had not changed. She went to Cale on the 7th day. He was in his study, which she had not expected. She had half expected to have to wait, to navigate whatever new arrangement the council was imposing after his refusal, to deal with an assistant or a guard, or a formal request for audience. But the door was open, because it was always open when he was working, and he was at his desk with maps spread out and his reading glasses on, which he was vain about and tried to remove whenever he thought someone was watching. And he looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and the glasses stayed on, and she thought that meant something. "You came," he said. He didn't move. "I came," she agreed. She stayed in the doorway. "I need to ask you something." "Ask." "When you refused the oath, was that for me? Or was it because you genuinely couldn't commit to Mira, and was I a convenient reason? Something that made the refusal feel principled instead of just cold feet." He took off the glasses then, slowly, and set them on the maps. He was quiet for long enough that she felt the question had been necessary, and that he understood it was necessary, that he was not insulted, but rather was taking it seriously, which she had always valued in him. "When I was standing there," he said, "in front of the council, in front of Mira's father, in front of everyone who had organized their expectations around what I was about to do, I thought about the night you told me the Gareth family was going to lose their Eastfields if I didn't intervene with the Water Rights Council. Do you remember that night?" She remembered. It had been late. He had been exhausted from 3 days of territorial negotiations, and she had come in with the Gareth file, and he had looked at her, like she was asking him to move a mountain, and she had sat down across from him and laid out every argument with the patient, particular thoroughness that she brought to things she believed in. "I thought about how you didn't leave, when I said I couldn't deal with it that night," he continued. "You stayed. You said, you don't have to deal with it tonight. I just need you to understand it, so that when you're ready, you don't have to start from nothing. And then you explained everything anyway, very calmly, and then you made tea, and you sat there, while I read through the file, and you didn't say anything else, and I sorted out the water rights 2 days later. And I thought, standing there, about to bind myself to someone else, that I had spent 11 months building something with you, that I had never in my life had with anyone, and not building it, that was the cowardice, not the oath." Ondine was silent for a moment. Outside, something moved in the garden, probably the sentinel, probably checking, as he always did, whether she had returned. "That's a good answer," she said. "It's the true answer. Those aren't always the same thing." "No," he almost smiled. "But this time, they are." She came away from the doorway and sat in the chair across from his desk, the one she had always sat in, the one that the cushion had shaped around her, over 11 months of late conversations. "I'm not going to pretend the last week didn't happen," she said. "I'm not going to walk in here and be exactly as I was, because I'm not exactly as I was. I know things now that I didn't know then. I know that I was, at least in part, a practicality, a stabilizing presence, while the political situation was unstable. I know that the council pushed for a formal arrangement, and you let them push without ever clarifying to me what that arrangement was or wasn't. I know that you knew Mira was coming, and you said nothing. Those things are true, and they need to be on the table. They're on the table," he said. He did not look away. "If we continue, and I'm not saying we continue, I'm saying if, I need to know that I'm not being held in place again. I need to know that when something is happening that affects both of us, you tell me. I need words, Cale." The look across the room was beautiful, and I want you to know it meant something to me, but I also need the words. He stood up from behind the desk and came around it, and he did not close the distance entirely. He stopped a few feet from her, respecting the boundary she had set without naming it, and she thought, not for the first time, that the things she valued most in him were the things he did quietly, without announcement. "Then I'll give you words," he said. "Now you want to know what you were and what you are? You are the person I go to first, before the council, before my sister, before the maps and the politics and the 1,000 things that constitute an alpha's life. You are the person I go to first, because you are the person whose judgment I trust most completely in the world, and I have wasted 11 months not telling you that clearly, because I was afraid that saying it out loud would make it real, and real things can be lost, and losing you was—" He stopped. "Losing you was the thing I could not look at directly." The fire in the small grate made a sound. Somewhere above them, a window was open, and she could hear pine wind. She got up from the chair. She crossed the distance between them, and she put her hand flat against his chest, not embracing him, just placing her hand there, feeling the steady, particular rhythm of him. "You lost me anyway," she said quietly, by not looking directly at it. "I know." His hand came up and covered hers, warm and certain. "I know that. I'm asking you not to let that be the last thing." She stood there with her hand against his chest, and she thought about the sentinel wolf at the garden gate, the one who had watched her walk away with amber eyes that held no cruelty and had padded beside her for 3 steps before the boundary stopped him. She thought about the wildflower Bee had pressed into her hand. She thought about her grandmother's chair and the fire she had built alone, and the clarity that had come, not immediately, but eventually, after the shock stopped echoing. She thought about what it would mean to stay, not as a practicality, not as a placeholder, but as the person he went to first. "I'm going to need time," she said. "How much time? I don't know. Enough to trust it again." "I'll wait," he said, with the simplicity of a statement that is not an offer, but a commitment, and she felt the difference in it. She stepped back. She took her hand back. She looked at him in the amber morning light, with his reading glasses still on the maps, and his dishonest silver temples, and the particular weight that an alpha who has just made a costly public refusal carries, and she said, "I'm going to go finish what I started in the village. There's a family I told I'd check in on. When I'm done, I'll come back. Not to the East Wing, not as a fixture. We'll figure out what comes next." "All right," he said. She left. She went back down the mountain path. She checked on Bia, who was entirely recovered and had already forgotten the worst of the cough, and was busy bossing her older brother around the yard, and she stayed for tea with the child's mother, and they talked about the coming winter and the state of the herb stores, and nothing that had anything to do with alphas or blood oaths, and it was, she found, deeply restorative. The days that followed had a new texture. She was not in the East Wing, but she was not absent either. She came to the great house in the mornings, when the council met, because Cale had asked if she would continue to advise on the settlement matters in the outer territories, and she had agreed to that, because it was work she believed in, and did well, and because separating her professional usefulness from her personal confusion seemed like the sensible thing. The council was navigating the aftermath of the refused oath, with varying degrees of grace. 2 members were straightforwardly furious. 3 were cautiously supportive. The eldest, a woman named Corrigan, who had known Cale since his childhood and had strong opinions about everything, told Ondine in passing one morning that she had always thought the Eastern arrangement was a bad idea, and that Ondine was worth 6 of any political match, which was so much more direct than Ondine had expected, that she laughed, and Corrigan looked satisfied and went back to her documents. Mira herself sent a note. Ondine had not expected this, and opened it with some apprehension, but the note was straightforward and carried a wry intelligence that Ondine found herself immediately respecting. It said, more or less, "I spent 2 years being told I was coming back for something I wasn't sure I wanted, and I spent the carriage journey here, composing the speech I would give, refusing the oath, and then your alpha saved me the trouble by refusing it first, so I owe him a certain debt of efficiency. I understand you are the reason for the refusal, or at least the honest one. I don't begrudge you that. I begrudge very little these days. The Eastern Territories teach you economy of feeling. I hope you know what you have. Ondine read it twice, and then put it carefully in the herb journal, beside the pressed wildflower. The weeks turned. She came back to the great house by degrees, the way something frozen thaws, not all at once but in places. First the morning council sessions, then the evening strategy discussions she had always been central to. Then, once, a dinner where she sat across from Cale, and they talked about the outer settlement proposal and the new water management plan, and she told him he was wrong about the northern survey, and he said she might be right, and asked her to explain, and she did, and he listened with his full attention the way he always had, and under the table, her foot was not quite touching his, almost, the precise measurement of almost, and she decided that this was enough for today, and that tomorrow might be different. The night it shifted properly was a council crisis, as most true shifts were. A dispute had erupted between two families in the Mid-Territory over grazing rights, the kind of dispute that started as practical and became personal with breathtaking speed, and by the time the messenger reached the great house, it had developed into a standoff with no injuries but a great deal of pride at stake on both sides. Cale needed to go. He asked Ondine to come, not as decoration and not as a formality, but because he said flatly, in front of 3 council members, that he wanted her assessment of the situation because she knew the Mid-Territory families better than anyone. She went. They rode out in the early evening, the 2 of them and 2 guards, through the mountain paths she knew well enough to navigate without thinking. The sentinel wolf ran with them for part of the way, a great moving shadow alongside the horses, and then peeled off into the forest with the quiet efficiency of a creature who knows its boundaries and respects them without resentment. The dispute was what it was. 2 proud men with old history and a piece of land neither could actually afford to lose, and neither could afford to yield. Ondine listened for 20 minutes, asking careful questions, and then she proposed a water-sharing arrangement she had been thinking about for 3 months for different reasons, and it fit the situation so precisely that both men agreed within the hour, which she suspected was partly because they were both relieved to find a way out that allowed them to remain dignified. On the ride back, the guards dropped behind, and she and Cale were side by side in the dark, with the pine smell, and the cold and the quiet. "You had that solution before we arrived," he said. "I had a version of it. I adjusted. You adjusted it in 20 minutes, while listening to 2 men who were talking in circles." They weren't talking in circles, they were talking around the real issue, which was that Aldrich's oldest son and Fenner's daughter were seen together at the autumn gathering, and both fathers are simultaneously hoping it goes somewhere, and terrified that it will. She paused. The land dispute is the land dispute, but it's also a way of maintaining a posture, while they wait to see if they're going to be family. Once I understood that, the water sharing was obvious. Cale was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him, and he was watching her with an expression she recognized from 11 months of looking, the particular expression she had once described to herself as the look he gave things he couldn't quite believe were real, mountains and rare hawks, and problems that resolved more cleanly than problems had any right to. "What?" she said. "Nothing," but he was still looking at her. "Cale, I was going to say something sentimental, and I decided against it. I'm going to need you to start saying the sentimental things," she said. "We established this." He laughed, which was unusual enough in public that the guards behind them exchanged a glance. "I was thinking," he said, "that you see things in people that most people miss entirely, and that I have spent a great deal of my life being seen by people who were looking at an alpha and seeing obligations and power and political utility, and that you look at me and see a man who is wrong about the Northern Survey," she said. "A man," he agreed. "Just a man. And that's," he stopped, "that's what I meant. In the study, when I said you're the person I go to first." She looked straight ahead at the path. The trees were enormous on either side, dark and still, and above them, the sky had opened into stars. "I see you," she said simply. "I've always seen you." That's the part that made the placeholder word cut so deep. Not because I doubted what I was to you exactly, but because I had been so thoroughly, consistently seen in what I was, and then I found out that everyone else had assigned me a role with an expiration date, and I couldn't quite reconcile the two things. They can't be reconciled, he said, because the second thing was wrong. There was no expiration date I intended. There was only my own failure to say that clearly. I know, she said. I know that now. And? She let the horses go another 50 paces. The mountain air was very cold and very clean, and she could feel it in the back of her throat, like water. And I'm here, she said. I rode out with you tonight. I'm here. He reached across the space between them, and his fingers found the back of her hand on the reins, not gripping, just touching, the way you touch something you're not sure you're allowed to hold yet, and she turned her hand over and let his fingers rest in her palm. They rode back like that, hand in hand in the dark, the guards respectfully looking at the middle distance, the stars doing what stars do, which is shine without any awareness of the significance they're occasionally assigned by people on horseback beneath them. Back at the great house, he walked her to the gate of the inner garden, not the east wing. She had not gone back to the east wing yet, and they both knew it. But he walked her to the garden gate, and he held her hand until the gate, and then he stopped. Can I? He started. Not yet, she said, but soon. He nodded. He did not push. That was one of the things, she thought. There were 100 things, accumulated over 11 months, but that one, the not pushing, the waiting at the gate when she asked him to, the nodding when she said not yet, was one of the important ones. She went through the gate, and she stood in the garden, and she listened to his footsteps go back toward the house, and she pressed her palm against the stone wall and felt the cold of it against her warm hand. Soon, she had said. She had meant it. It was 11 days later that the real crisis arrived, and when it did, it arrived not with ceremony, but with mud on its boots. The outer settlement families had been struggling all autumn, which was nothing new, but a particularly bad early frost had taken most of the late harvest, and what had been a manageable shortage had become a genuine hardship. The reports reached the council on a Tuesday morning, and the discussion around the table became immediately political, in the particular way that discussions around tables always become political when resources are the subject, which is to say that people began talking about what was possible instead of what was necessary. Ondine sat through 20 minutes of it, and then she said, clearly and without raising her voice, 3 children in the northern settlements have been sick for the past 2 weeks, and their families can't afford the medicines. That is the thing we are discussing. Not allocation models, not the political relationship between the inner territories and the outer ones. 3 children and their families, and a frost that came too early, and what this pack is going to do about it. The room was quiet. What do you propose? Said Corrigan, who already knew, Ondine thought, but was giving her the floor. Ondine proposed it. She had been thinking about it for a week, had been building the case quietly in the margins of other work, and she laid it out now, with the thoroughness she always brought to things she believed in. A direct relief supply from the pack's winter stores, which were better than usual this year. A healer rotation to the outer settlements, herself included. A plan to work with the outer settlement elders on spring planting to prevent the same crisis recurring. And a formal recognition, in council records, that the outer settlement families were not separate from the pack, but constituent parts of it, which was a political statement as well as a practical one, but she had decided to make it anyway. The 2 furious council members were immediately skeptical. The other 4 were not. Cale had said nothing through her presentation, which she had learned to read as attention rather than absence, and when the skeptical members had finished their objections, he said, "The healer rotation begins this week. The supply allocation is approved." And that was that. After the meeting, Corrigan found her in the corridor. "You know what you just did," she said. "I made an argument for an emergency relief measure," Ondine said. "You made a political argument for the structural relationship between the inner and outer territories. You did it by centering 3 sick children, so that anyone who opposed it looked monstrous, and you did it in 11 minutes. That," Corrigan said, "is not healing. That is leadership." Ondine thought about this, on the way to the outer settlements. She thought about it while she was treating the children, who were not gravely ill, but were tired and thin, in the way that children become when their parents are frightened, and who responded to her careful attention with the particular gratitude of the very young, which is the most complete gratitude there is. She thought about it while she was meeting with the settlement elders, 3 women and 1 man, who had been managing their communities through hard seasons for decades, and who had very specific, intelligent ideas about what they needed, and had simply never been asked. She came back to the great house in the dark, 2 days later, cold and tired, and carrying 3 pages of notes from the elder meetings, and Cale was in the kitchen, which was not where alphas typically were at that hour, and he was making soup, which was not something she had ever known him to do. "You make soup," she said. "My sister taught me." He gestured at a chair. "Sit down. You look like the mountain tried to keep you." She sat. The kitchen was warm, and smelled of stock and rosemary, and she took off her wet boots and felt the flagstones warm under her feet, and she was suddenly, overwhelmingly tired, not unhappily tired, but the deep, wholesome tiredness of work that mattered. "Tell me about the settlements," he said. He ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of her and sat across from her, and she told him. Not a report, not a council presentation, just the truth of it. The tired parents and the children who were going to be fine. The elder women who had been managing things with elegance and no resources. The plans that could work if someone was willing to actually implement them. He listened the way he always listened, completely and without interruption. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I want to create a formal settlement council, an advisory body with real input into inner council decisions. I've been thinking about it for months, and I didn't know how to structure it, and you've just described the structure. Use the elders," she said. "They have the expertise, they just need the channel. Will you help me build it?" She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the soup-warm fire-lit room, with her wet boots by the door, and his reading glasses, predictably, upstairs. "Yes," she said. "I'll help you build it." He reached across the table and tucked a piece of hair back from her face, with the same certainty he'd brought to everything, and she leaned into it just slightly, just enough, and neither of them said anything, because nothing needed to be said in that particular moment. The moment was already complete. That night, she slept in the East Wing. Not because anything had been resolved or declared or sworn, because she was tired, and the East Wing was warm, and when he said goodnight at the top of the stairs, there was a quality to it that was like the beginning of something, rather than the continuation of something old, and she found she was ready for that. In the morning, she found the amber earrings on the table by the East Wing window. She had left them in the village. He had gotten them back and left them without a note, which she thought was exactly the right choice, because a note would have made them into a statement, and the earrings were better as themselves, 2 small amber pieces that had gotten something wrong the first time and were here now, asking for another chance. She put them on. Her eyes were dark gray like winter sea. She had always known that. They matched anyway. The settlement council took 3 weeks to formally establish, and the process was not smooth. The 2 oppositional council members pushed back at every turn, which Ondine had expected, and she dealt with each objection with the patient particular thoroughness she brought to things she believed in, and Corrigan seconded her arguments with the air of a woman who has been waiting a long time for someone to make them. Cale chaired the meetings with the steady authority that was his nature, and said very little beyond strategic moments when he said very decisive things. The elder women came to the inner house for the first formation meeting, and they brought their knowledge and their precision, and their barely concealed skepticism, which Ondine thought was appropriate. She met the skepticism directly, laying out the structure and the mandate and the actual decision-making power the new body would have, not advisory in the hollow sense, but in the sense of genuine input with formal weight, and the eldest of the elders, a woman named Vesa who was 70 years old, and had the eyes of a person who had been promised things and watched them dissolve before, listened to all of it, and then said, simply, "If you mean it, we'll see." "We mean it," Ondine said. "Not you," Vesa said, with a particular precision. "Him." And she looked at Cale. Cale met her eyes. We mean it, he said, and if we don't follow through, you'll know who to come to. Vesa looked at Ondine with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and approval. You, she said to Ondine. Yes, we'll come to you. Ondine felt something settle in her chest, something that had been floating loose since the night outside the open window, since the word placeholder, since the amber earrings left on a table. It was not resolution exactly. It was orientation, the feeling of knowing where you are. After the meeting, in the garden, with the last of the autumn light going gold through the pine branches, and the sentinel wolf making his slow rounds across the lower path, Kale came and stood beside her. Not in front of her, beside her, the side-by-side that had always been their natural arrangement. She's going to be formidable, he said, about Vesa. That's the point, Ondine said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at her, studying the middle distance in the way of someone who has decided to say the difficult thing, I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that the answer can be no, not no for now, actually no, and if it's no, I'll understand it, and I won't. Kale, she said. Ask. He turned to look at her. He had the reading glasses in his hand, turning them over, the tell she had identified months ago as the one that meant he was working something out. I want to do this properly, the thing we've been building toward. I want to do it with intention and words, and the council knowing, and the pack knowing, and no ambiguity about what you are to me, or what I am to you. I want, he stopped, started again. I want to ask you to be my mate, not a placeholder, not a political stabilizer, not a useful presence. My mate. The person I go to first and last, and every time in between. The person whose name I say when I mean the person I trust most in the world. I want to ask you that, and I want you to know that I'm asking it, knowing you might say that it's too soon, or that you need more time, or that you're not sure, and those answers are real, and I'll take them seriously. The pine wind moved through the garden. Somewhere in the lower meadow, the pack wolves were ranging, distant and unhurried, the sound of them reaching her as a kind of presence rather than a noise. She thought about the night outside the window, and the walk in the dark, and the fire she'd built alone. She thought about the village, and Bia's wildflower, and Saren's halting apology, and Mira's wry, intelligent note. She thought about Soup in the kitchen, and riding in the dark with his hand in hers, and 3 pages of notes from elder meetings, and the feeling of having both a direction and the person she wanted beside her in it. She thought about her grandmother's chair, and what she had asked herself in it, sitting in the cold with the fire just lit, working out what she actually, in the marrow of her, wanted. I'm not going to say it's too soon, she said. I know what I know. I've known it for 11 months, and I knew it through walking away, and through the 7 days in the village, and through the ride back from the mid-territory dispute, with your hand in mine. I know what I know. He waited. But I want the words in front of the council, she said. Not a private agreement. I want the acknowledgement to be public, because the silence was public. Kale, everyone in this pack knew what the situation was before I did. I want the clarity to be just as public. Yes, he said, immediately, without hesitation. And I want Vesa invited. Something passed across his face that was almost a smile. Vesa, he said. If the settlement council is going to mean something, she should be present for the moment when the alpha's mate is confirmed. It sends a message. It sends several messages. Good, I have several messages to send. He was definitely smiling now, the smile that appeared rarely and meant something when it did. All right, he said. Vesa, the council, the words, publicly. Then yes, she said. Yes, Kale, that's my answer. He took one step, and she took one step, and they were close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, and he put both hands on her face, carefully, the way you handle something that matters, and he bent and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that, breathing the same cold pine air, the amber earrings at her ears catching the last of the gold light, not speaking because the speaking was done. The sentinel wolf on the lower path sat down and looked at the sky with the satisfied expression of a very large creature, whose particular job it was to watch over things, and found everything to be in order. The formal declaration before the council happened 4 days later. Ondine wore the dark red dress she had been keeping for no occasion she had named out loud, and the amber earrings, and her hair the way she always wore it, because she was not performing anything, only being exactly what she was, in front of the people who needed to see it. Vesa was in the front row, and her expression revealed nothing, but when Kale spoke the formal words, the old ones, the ones that meant, in this pack's tradition, not a binding ceremony, but an acknowledgement of chosen companionship, a statement of intent made in community, Vesa gave a single slow nod that Ondine received like a gift. The 2 oppositional council members were stiff but present. Their presence was its own kind of concession. Corrigan was in the back of the room, and she looked, Ondine thought, privately delighted, in the contained way of a person who has been right about something for a long time, and is refraining from saying "I told you so," out of character, rather than lack of desire. Saren was there. They had not spoken at length since the market square, but Saren had sent a note that said, in her direct and somewhat clumsy way, "I am glad you came back." Ondine had written back, "I am too." It was not everything, but it was the beginning of something that might, given time and honesty, become a friendship worth having. When the words were finished, when the formal acknowledgement was complete, and the room had shifted from ceremony to the shuffling movement of people released from formality, Kale took her hand and kept it, not performatively, not for the room. Just because it was his hand, and it was her hand, and that was where they were. Outside afterward, in the evening air, the pack's wolves moved through the lower meadow in the way they did at dusk, unhurried and sovereign, their outlines dark against the fading sky. The sentinel had been joined by 2 others, a lighter-coated female and a younger wolf who kept pace slightly behind, and the 3 of them moved together, with the easy coordination of things that understood their relationships completely. Ondine watched them, and felt the lump in her throat that sometimes came from beauty when she wasn't prepared for it. "What are you thinking?" Kale said. "I'm thinking about being known," she said, "about how long I spent making myself useful, to the point where I thought usefulness was what I was, and how strange it is to be here, in this moment, as just myself, as the person, not the function." He turned to look at her. "You've always been the person to me. I know that now." She leaned against him, her shoulder against his arm, and he adjusted to accommodate her. Easy and natural, the way 2 people move who have been learning each other's weight and have finally gotten it right. "I know that now, and I believed it then, but the doubt is a very loud thing when someone gives it a name." "Placeholder," he said, and the word had a different quality in his voice. Not pain, but acknowledgement, the kind you give to things you need to look at clearly in order to move past them. "Placeholder," she agreed. "That's what they called it. But I stayed anyway, and then I left, and then I came back, and I think," she thought about how to say it, "I think the leaving mattered. I think knowing I could leave, and finding the way back on my own terms, that's the thing that makes it real. Not the ceremony, the choosing." "You kept choosing," he said. "I kept choosing," she confirmed. "Even when it was hard. Even when the choice was to walk away first and ask questions later. That's what I want you to understand. I didn't come back because you refused the oath, or because you stood up in front of the council and made a costly gesture. Those things mattered, but they didn't bring me back. I came back because I looked at what I wanted, and it was this. Still, even after everything, I came back for myself." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. Then, "Good. I want you here for yourself. I need you here for yourself. A version of you that's here because of obligation, or gratitude, or a dramatic gesture, is not the version I want." "I know," she said. "That's also one of the reasons." Below them in the meadow the wolves had settled. The sentinel sat, and the female lay with her head on her paws, and the younger one circled twice, and then settled too, and the meadow was still, and the sky above it was moving through its colors, the rust and gold of the day, giving way to the deeper blues of evening, and Ondine stood in the cold air with the man who had gotten it wrong, and told the truth about it, and waited at the gate when she asked him to, and made soup in the kitchen at midnight, and said her name in front of the council, with the words that meant, "I choose this, I choose her," and she felt the particular solidity of a life that had been tested and held. Not because nothing had broken, because she had built something strong enough to survive the breaking and the remaking. The weeks after the declaration settled into a shape that felt like a life rather than a situation. The Settlement Council held its first formal session, and Vesa asked 3 questions that sent 2 of the inner council members back to their records and established immediately that she was not there to be decorative. Ondine attended as both the initiating advocate and, for the first time, as the alpha's mate, and she felt the dual weight of those roles and decided they were compatible, that in fact, they had always been compatible, and it was only the silence around the second that had made them seem separate. The winter came hard and early, but the supply allocation she had argued for meant that the outer settlements had what they needed, and the elder network that the Settlement Council had formalized meant that information moved more quickly, and shortages were identified and addressed before they became crises. She spent 3 days a week in the villages, cycling through the settlements with her healer's kit and her 3 pages of notes that had grown into 20 pages and then into a proper record of the outer communities, their needs and their resources, and their particular intelligences. Bea was perfectly healthy and had developed an interest in herbs that her mother attributed to Ondine's visits, and that Ondine was quietly encouraging with small gifts of seeds and a simple journal for keeping notes. Because a child who understood plants was a child who would understand a great deal about the world, and Ondine believed in building those kinds of understandings early. She moved fully back into the great house in the 2nd month of winter, not into the east wing, which they had agreed was a room of the old arrangement and deserved to become something else, a spare room, a guest room, a room for the settlement elders to use when they had to stay overnight, which Vesa did once, and apparently found entirely satisfactory. Ondine's things went into the rooms that Kale had always kept as his own, which were larger and faced the forest and had a window she loved immediately, the kind of deep-set window with a stone seat where you could sit with tea and watch the trees do what trees do in winter, which is hold their shape against the cold with a patience she admired. She put her herb journal on the table by that window. She hung her grandmother's shawl on the hook behind the door. She put the amber earrings in the small wooden dish on the dresser and did not leave them anywhere. There was a night, deep in winter, when a storm came down off the mountain with more force than any of them had expected, and the great house settled and creaked around its weight, and they sat up late by the fire, not working for once, just being present in the room. She was reading and he was reading, and the fire made its particular sounds, and outside the wind moved through the pine trees with a note like low music, and she looked up from her book and found him looking at her with the expression she knew, the one she had once described to herself as the look he gave things he couldn't quite believe were real. "Still doing that," she said. "Probably always will," he said. She went back to her book. She was smiling in the way that happens when you're not performing anything for anyone, just the small interior shift of a person who is, in this specific moment, exactly where they mean to be. Outside, the storm did what storms do, which is be enormous and temporary, and the morning after it, the world was under 3 feet of new snow, and the pine trees were transformed into something structural and strange, and the wolves who ranged in the lower meadow moved through the white with the complete authority of creatures who find every condition of the world hospitable, because they have never doubted their right to be in it. Ondine stood at the deep-set window with her tea, and watched them, and felt herself, for the first time in a long time, doing the same thing, not doubting, not waiting for the word that would reassign her, not listening outside the window for her own diminishment, just standing in the winter light, certain of her own name, certain of her own place, watching the wolves run free in the new snow, while the man who had chosen her honestly, finally, in public and in words, slept in the room behind her, and would wake soon, and come to stand beside her, not in front of her, beside her, the way it had always been their nature to be. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, and felt the winter on the other side of it, and her own warmth on this side, and she thought about her grandmother's chair, and what she had asked herself in it. What did she want? Not what was practical, but what she actually, in the marrow of her, wanted. She had wanted this. She had kept choosing this. She was here. The word placeholder was not gone from her memory, and she did not need it to be. It was the stone that had landed in still water. It was the word that had made the ripples. Without it, she might have continued in comfortable uncertainty, might have let the 11 months become 12 become more, might have never walked away and never had to walk back, and never known that she was doing the walking herself. The word had done her a service she had not asked for and had not wanted. She thought she could hold that. Not gratitude exactly, just the particular clear-eyed honesty of a woman who knows the shape of her own story and does not need it to have been easier in order to appreciate where it ended up. Cale's footsteps were coming down the hallway, unhurried, certain. She heard him pause in the doorway behind her. "You're up early," he said. "The light," she said. "Post-storm light. I didn't want to miss it." He came and stood beside her. He looked out at the wolves in the new snow. His shoulder was warm against hers. "Vesa sent a message this morning," he said. "She wants to expand the Settlement Council's mandate to include dispute mediation in the Outer Territories." She framed it as a question, but it read like a statement. "Because it is," Ondine said. "She's right. Add it." "I thought you'd say that." He paused. "I told her we'd discuss it at the next session. Which means you've already decided, and you want me in the room when it's formalized." "Yes," he said, simply, directly, without apology. She smiled at the window. "All right." The wolves ran in the snow below them, and the light came through the trees in long white lines, and the house was warm at their backs, and she drank her tea, and he stood beside her, and outside the world was remade, and immediate, and entirely present, the way the world always is, after a storm, and they were in it together, the two of them, chosen and choosing, with all the particular difficulty and fullness that honest choosing carries. She had been called a placeholder. She had left before the blood oath was signed. She had come back as herself, on her own terms, for her own reasons. And that, she understood, was the only way any of it could have meant what it did. The spring came, in the way springs always come in mountain country, not gradually, but in surges. 3 warm days followed by a return of cold, the snowdrops appearing and then disappearing under a late frost, and then appearing again, more determined the second time, as if the interruption had clarified their intention. Ondine had always loved this about the mountain spring, the insistence of it, the refusal to be discouraged by conditions. She was in the inner garden when the message arrived from the Eastern Territories. She read it twice, standing in the weak March sunlight with mud on her boots and a cutting of early sage in her hand, and then she went inside to find Cale. He was already in the study with Corrigan, which told her the council had received the message too. She came in without knocking, which she had always done, and Corrigan looked up with the expression of a person who has been waiting for the right variable to arrive, and is relieved it has finally appeared. The message was from Mira, not from her father, not through official channels, but from Mira herself, in the direct and wry voice of her earlier note, and it carried news that changed the shape of several things. The Eastern Alpha had died over the winter, not violently, but of an illness he had kept quiet from his council and his daughter both, and Mira was now the Eastern Alpha, which was not a role she had sought, but was apparently one she had accepted, with the same economy of feeling she brought to everything. She was writing to open formal relations between the Eastern and Northern Territories. She was writing, she said in the last line, because she had heard that the Northern Pack had built something called a settlement council, and she wanted to know more about it, because she had 3 outer communities of her own who had been waiting for exactly that kind of structure, and she did not intend to make them wait longer. Ondine read the message a second time and felt something warm move through her chest that was very close to joy. "She wants to collaborate," Corrigan said, with the air of someone confirming something she had already decided. She wants to learn from what we built, Ondine said carefully, because she had learned that the framing mattered, which is different from collaboration, but could lead to it. I'll write back, Kale said. He was looking at Ondine, with the question already formed behind his eyes. Invite her here, Ondine said. Bring Vesa to the meeting. Let the settlement council speak for itself. Corrigan made a sound of deep approval. Kale wrote the letter. Ondine went back to the garden with her sage cutting and her muddy boots, and she stood in the March light and thought about the shapes that things make when they are allowed to develop honestly, the unexpected geometries of trust built over time, the way one true thing leads to another. Mira arrived in the 4th week of spring, without ceremony and without her father's retinue, just herself and 2 advisors, and the kind of road weariness that sits well on people who are accustomed to it. She was exactly as Ondine had imagined from her letters, vivid and precise, and carrying an authority that was entirely her own, rather than borrowed from her title. They recognized each other immediately, in the way that certain kinds of women recognize each other, the ones who have had to argue for every room they occupied, and have become formidable, rather than diminished by the effort. You built the settlement council, Mira said, the first evening, not as a question. I built the argument for it, Ondine said. Vesa built the structure. Mira smiled. It was a small and useful smile. I want to meet Vesa. Tomorrow morning, Ondine said. She's expecting you. I should warn you that she'll have questions. Good, said Mira. I have answers, and more questions than she does. The 3 days of Mira's visit were some of the most productive Ondine could remember, which was saying something given the previous months. Vesa and Mira sat across from each other on the first morning and spent 2 hours in the kind of conversation that happens when 2 very intelligent people discover they have been solving the same problem from opposite sides of the same mountain. And by the end of it, there was a framework on the table for an interterritorial information exchange that both of them were already improving as they described it. Ondine watched this from the far end of the room and felt the particular satisfaction of having created the conditions for something to happen without needing to be at the center of it. This, she thought, was what leadership actually looked like, not the performance of authority, but the construction of circumstances in which the right people found each other. On the last evening of Mira's visit, the 2 of them walked in the garden together, while the men talked politics inside, and the spring air carried the smell of thawed earth and new growth. They walked in a companionable quiet for a while, and then Mira said, He's different with you than I expected. Ondine glanced at her. Different how? Less defended. Mira considered this. I knew him before, when we were young and the arrangement was assumed. He was always, closed is the word, correct in everything, precise, generous in the formal way, but closed, like a house, where all the windows have good curtains. She paused. The windows are open now. Ondine thought about the soup in the kitchen at midnight, the reading glasses left on the maps, the way he stood beside her rather than in front of her. Yes, she said. I think they are. That took something, Mira said, from him and from you both. It took leaving, Ondine said, and coming back deliberately, and a great deal of saying the thing out loud, instead of assuming it was understood. Mira made a sound of recognition. I'm building something similar in the east. Slower. We have more damage to clear first. She looked at the sky above the pine trees. But I'm building it. When Mira left in the morning, she embraced Ondine, with the brief warmth of a woman who does not embrace casually, which made it mean more rather than less. And she told Kale that his northern pack was fortunate, in ways it was probably still working out how to deserve, which made Corrigan laugh outright, and which Kale received with the particular graceful honesty of a man who had learned to accept accurate assessments without deflecting them. Summer arrived and then deepened, and the settlement council became in practice what it had always been in intention, a genuine governing body with real authority over the matters that most directly affected the outer communities. Vesa attended the inner council sessions now as a formal member, which the 2 oppositional members had eventually accepted, not because they had changed their minds, but because they had recognized that the alternative was to look perpetually obstructionist in front of the record, and neither of them wanted that as their legacy. Ondine continued her healer's rotation, which she had refused to give up when her role in the inner council expanded, because she believed the work kept her honest in a way that purely administrative work could not. Bia was growing and thriving, and had filled 2 journals with plant notes and pressed specimens, and her mother had begun calling Ondine by her given name rather than the formal address, which was the kind of small specific welcome that Ondine valued most. On a warm evening in late summer, she was sitting in the deep-set window with a letter from Mira about the Eastern Settlement Exchange and a cup of cold tea she had forgotten to drink, and Kale came in from a long day of outdoor council business, still smelling of sun and pine and the exertion of the mountain, and he sat beside her on the wide stone seat, which fit them both if they were willing to sit close, and she moved the letter aside and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the forest together, in the easy way of people who have nothing to prove to each other. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." The blood oath. She felt him still slightly, not the one that was almost signed with someone else. The ceremony itself, the form of it. She lifted her head to look at him. "I want to understand what it means to you, whether it's something you want, whether it's something we want." He was quiet for a moment, the thinking quiet, rather than the difficult one. "The blood oath is a public binding," he said finally. "A formal declaration made in the old form, in front of the whole pack, not just the council, everyone." He paused. "I wanted it, once, because I thought it was what an alpha was supposed to do. Then I refused it, because it would have been dishonest. Now, she prompted. "Now I want it because of what it actually is," he said. "Not obligation, not political architecture, because you are my person, and I want the pack to know it, in the oldest language they have." She considered this. She looked out at the forest, where the evening light was going amber through the trees, the same color as the earrings in the dish on the dresser, and she thought about the stone dropped in still water, and the ripples, and how far they had traveled, and where they had brought her. "Then let's do it," she said. "Properly, with Vesa present, with the outer settlement families invited, not as an afterthought, but as part of the pack, because that's what this year has been about, hasn't it? Making the boundaries honest." He turned to look at her with the expression she knew. "The unbelievable thing. You," he said, "are extraordinary." "I'm practical," she said, but she was smiling. The blood oath ceremony happened on the last day of summer, when the mountain was at its most generous, and the light lasted long into the evening, and the whole of the pack gathered in the great meadow, inner territory and outer settlements together, which had not been done in living memory, and which felt, to everyone present, like exactly the correct thing. Vesa stood in the front with the inner council members, her expression revealing nothing but her presence, saying everything about what the year had built and what the future was intended to hold. Corrigan stood beside her, and the 2 of them together looked like a pair of women who had been waiting for this particular arrangement of the world, and were privately satisfied to see it arrive. The words of the oath were old, and carried the weight of old things, and when Kale spoke them, his voice was steady and certain and unhurried, and when Ondine spoke her part, she felt them land in her chest, not as performance, but as truth, the formal language finding the truth that had been there since before she had known how to name it. The sentinel wolf sat at the edge of the meadow and watched with amber eyes. He was entirely calm. He had always known. When it was finished, the evening opened up around them, the pack celebrating in the way of people who have been through difficult seasons and have emerged with something that is both new and necessary, with food and fire, and the kind of uncomplicated joy that follows from hard-won rightness. Ondine moved through it all with Kale beside her, and the amber earrings at her ears catching firelight, and she felt, underneath the celebration, the quiet, steady thing that had been building since her grandmother's chair, and the fire she'd built alone, and the 2-hour walk in the dark, along a path she'd known well enough to manage without a lantern. She was not a placeholder, she was not a stabilizer, or a useful presence, or a practical arrangement. She was the person he went to first and last, and every time in between. And she was here because she had chosen it, and the choosing had been hard and real and entirely her own. The mountain held the night, and the fire held the warmth, and the wolves ranged free, in the darkness beyond the meadow's edge. And Ondine held her mate's hand, and looked out at the life they had made, and found it was exactly, precisely, sufficiently true.